Good evening, and thank you all for coming to campus tonight and watching our live broadcast. I'm Dr. Sonia Dewey, Director of Loyola University's School of Mass Communication. Welcome to a public forum on journalism in New Orleans. This event is designed to do two things: present you with national context to the changes in the news media we're seeing right here in New Orleans, and to ask you, the community, what kind of news and information you want and how you'd like it delivered. I was born and raised in the city of Plaquemine and spent my undergraduate degree years here. I worked as a television journalist myself for several years in the capital city, so I know about the wealth of news this area has to offer. As director of the School of Mass Communication, I understand this rapidly changing world of journalism. In fact, here at Loyola, we are already planning for this new world by developing and building a state-of-the-art digital media laboratory. The changes, all a part of a communication universe where people learn of breaking stories through social media and where influential bloggers add context to stories. And increasingly, the audience, the audience, is getting involved. That's why Loyola is sponsoring this event. It's critically important that journalists and you, the community that journalists serve, understand each other and are having two-way conversations. Gatherings like this help make that happen. We're glad you agree and came out tonight to take part. The organizer and host of tonight's discussion is the New Orleans Coalition on Open Governance, which consists of 8 nonprofit organizations, all listed in the program. The co-sponsors for tonight: the Foundation for Louisiana, Greater New Orleans Inc., and Loyola University's School of Mass Communication. We've got a great panel here, and I'm going to take a seat and turn it over to them. Moderating tonight's event, Steve Beatty, Managing Editor of The Lens, the first online nonprofit newsroom in New Orleans. Before helping to launch The Lens in 2010, Steve worked at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution as an investigative news editor. Before that, the Times-Picayune for some 15 years. Again, thank you all for being here for what promises to be a fascinating evening.
Thank you, Dr. Dewey. We appreciate your generosity and that of Loyola University in making this event possible. I look around the room here at a lot of colleagues and people that I've worked with over the years, and I see people who have won Peabodys and Pulitzers and Murrow Awards and Emmys, and it's very heartening to see that kind of talent in the room. But more importantly, I see a lot of other reporters and those same reporters who have brought us the news of increases in our water bills, or let us know when our streets are torn up, or more torn up than they usually are. And they profile political candidates, and they cover the countless items that make life essential and the things that we need to be equipped if we're going to be active and involved citizens. And it's more important for me to see a full audience of those kind of reporters than anyone else. As Dr. Dewey said, this evening is meant to be a forward-looking event, a chance for us to understand from you, our audience, what news is important to you and how you would like to consume it. Clearly, the changes announced by the Times-Picayune were the catalyst for this event, but this isn't intended to be a debate this evening about the merits of those moves. In fact, this is probably a long overdue conversation about changes that have been taking way in the news media for several years. Other efforts announced since the Times-Picayune made its decisions known over the past few weeks makes this even more relevant. Actually, this came together in a brief conversation with someone probably 2 days after the TP announced changes, and we said, you know, that might be a good idea to see how fast we can turn it out, and the fact that we were able to do it at a time when other announcements were made. There's a new effort at the University of New Orleans to start a nonprofit organization. The Baton Rouge Advocate has announced changes to get involved in the New Orleans market, and my outfit, The Lens, has teamed up with some other publishers. All that happened kind of in a flurry in the past 2 weeks. We looked brilliant for having scheduled this when we did. It was completely by accident. I would like to take a moment to announce some special visitors that we have here. The New Orleans Citizen Diplomacy Corps has brought in 8 visitors from Africa to understand how we do journalism and reach out to the public. We've got guests here from Cameroon, Ghana, Mozambique, Nigeria, Rwanda, South Africa, and Tanzania. I hope that, where are they? There they are. So once again, this is a chance for you to offer the collective wisdom to the news outlets in the region. If every news outlet that is here or watching online is able to respond in some way to what the public wants, I think that's a true win for the community, regardless of outlet, medium, platform. I'll take a quick run through our panel. To my immediate left, Kevin Davis is the Chief Executive Officer of the Investigative News Network, a growing consortium of 64 nonprofit newsrooms across the country, producing nonpartisan, investigative, and public interest journalism. Kevin oversees the organization's efforts to promote sustainability at member organizations while increasing the impact of their reporting through collaboration. To his left, Jamal Watkins. He is Chief of Staff for the Center for Social Inclusion. Jamal has a strong history of program management in the field of racial justice, including development of policy reform, cultivation of partnerships, and management collaborations. Keith Woods is occupying the key center spot here at our table. He is the Vice President of Diversity for News and Operations at National Public Radio. His focus is to help NPR and member stations strengthen the breadth and depth of diversity in their content, staff, audience, and work environment. He's taught writing and reporting on race relations, ethics, and diversity, and he was previously Poynter Institute's Director of Diversity. Most importantly, he is a native New Orleanian and a former city editor at the Times-Picayune. That's why we put him in the middle. To his left is a colleague, a former colleague, who is still at the Poynter Institute. She is Kelly McBride. She's a senior faculty ethics reporting faculty member for the Poynter Institute. In addition to teaching the craft of journalism, she teaches reporters and editors from around the world skills to strengthen their ethical decision-making. She is a recovering daily journalist. She worked as a reporter for 15 years, most of that time in Spokane, Washington, covering crime, courts, and religion. She is also the lead on Poynter's Sense-Making project. This is an initiative designed to figure out how democracy works as professional media contracts. And to Kelly's left, we have Christopher Sopher. He is the Media Innovation Project Manager at the Knight Foundation, which finances creative journalism efforts nationwide. Before joining Knight, he researched digital media and public policy at the Emerging Media Research Council. He's written and spoken internationally about young people's engagement with news media and civic life. We welcome them all. All right, I'm going to start it off with kicking it over to Kelly for a little bit of background. Can you tell us, are we the only city to go through such major changes at our major news operation, and how have others reacted to that?
Well, I think you're going through these changes in a most dramatic fashion, but you're certainly not the only city to go through this, and I don't think that you'll be the only city for long. There are other cities where the newspaper has stopped publishing. Ann Arbor, Michigan is one of them. In Detroit, the newspaper only delivers to homes, I think 3 or 4 days a week. And if you want the newspaper on other days, you have to go to a box to get it. And I think that this is, I think that what's happening in New Orleans is essentially you've gone from, in the media environment, being maybe 5 years behind the time to being 3 to 5 years ahead of times in about 2 months. So if it feels like it's been a fairly rocky ride, it has been. I mean, you're moving really fast right now, but it's certainly not something that we who watch media, it's not surprising to us that a major daily newspaper is contracting its publishing schedule.
Well, Kevin, how have other newspapers or media markets reacted when such things have happened?
Well, I think that if you look around the country, you know, there was a report recently from the FCC about the information needs of communities, which was actually done I think in conjunction on the behest of Knight Foundation Initiative. But they talk about news deserts. They talk about communities, whole swaths of this country that don't have primary news sources within their communities. And that's, I think, really that's not what's happening here, right? I think that we're talking about something very different. We're talking about here a reaction to a contraction in a commercial enterprise. And the groups that I represent, the members of Investigative News Network, are all nonprofits, right? So we are all effectively, according to the IRS, educational charities. We are mission-driven. We are here to make sure that citizens and communities have the information that they need to make educated decisions, right? So what we have here in New Orleans, and with the different initiatives that are starting, as well as the lens which is already here, is we actually have a diverse set of voices that are trying to serve the community. And I think what this whole thing is about tonight is about how is that going to come together? How are voices that may not be represented today through the commercial medium, how are they going to be included? And how is this going to mesh up? So I think, to Kelly's point, this is a unique venue for this kind of conversation, but it's happening in lots of different places. We see, for example, that there are markets like Austin, Texas, or the Bay Area, or Boston. These are large markets that have multiple nonprofits serving communities, along with alternative media, along with commercial media. So, from my perspective, this is part of the evolution of today's media.
And Jamal, Kevin mentioned reaching out to people who have been marginalized or not included in traditional news coverage. You work for an outfit called the Center for Social Inclusion. I would think this might be up your alley.
Well, first and foremost, when we think about inclusive policies and approaches to access to media, most people are familiar with this, right? Raise your hand if you have a cell phone. Keep your hand raised if you have a smartphone. And if you don't know what the difference is, smartphone, you can get online, and there's apps, and there's all these gadgets that... Now, how many of you have an unlimited data plan connected to your smartphone? Okay. So there's arguments that those of you who have a smartphone with an unlimited data plan, that's the way of the future or the way forward, that you can have access to media. But according to Pew, it finds that only 83% of adults actually have cell phones, and of them, only 35% have smartphones. And so you're talking about a small percentage of the adult population that otherwise has access in an unlimited way to information. Because for those of you who don't have these plans, it's very expensive, wouldn't you say, to have unlimited data? It's costly. So if you think about marginalized communities, communities of color, communities that are not in the traditional fray, they don't have the same type of access, if you will, to what we would normally consider to be, the information superhighway. And what's even more ironic is that in a state like Louisiana, when we talk about broadband, for example, and broadband infrastructure, you all know that your leadership kind of rejected some funds that would have been utilized to really create the infrastructure in rural communities and communities here in the state. And so the issue around inclusion is really about access, but it goes beyond that because it's also speaking around ownership and inclusion. And the only way to bridge that gap is to have a different type of dialogue than depending on one sole source of information, i.e. a newspaper owned by a specific family. And so I think as we begin to wrestle with that, you really have to open up the Pandora's box around what it really means to have inclusive policies and inclusion holistically. And
we've come to understand that New Orleans doesn't lead the way in broadband subscription rates for a lot of households. For people who held up their phone with the unlimited access, does that count as broadband? Is that full access, or what's the distinction?
Ironically, for those of you, it's not. So when you talk about broadband infrastructure, what studies have found is that in lower-income communities, and in particular communities of color, the infrastructure, meaning there's copper wiring, there's fiber optic lines and cables that have to be put in place in order for broadband to truly exist, that sort of infrastructure doesn't exist in many communities. And in particular, when you talk about this issue of access, it's not, oh, let's build a library that has 3 computers. Because usually that's what people say, oh, now we have access. It's really about the infrastructure because there's a business element to it, there's a job creations element to it, and there's even a policy element to it that the FCC, for example, is currently wrestling with. How do we allow for community-scale projects to really penetrate the broadband community? And what that means is community-based, community-led, community-owned. And at the end of the day, it really is about people wanting to see what's happening, to know what's going on, and to make informed decisions. And so if you don't have access to information, then those things don't play out in the way that it should, and the policies don't work in the way that they should.
Chris, I saw you down there nodding knowingly at a couple points.
Not knowingly, but I mean, the only thing I would add to that is, you know, one of the things we find in trying to do media innovation related work is that a lot of our conversation about sort of the future of technology and information comes from Silicon Valley, comes from a world of technology development that is both by and for like the 1% of people, whether that's in wealth or in access to technology or what have you. And so that's, I mean, what you're saying definitely resonates with, you know, with what, a lot of what we find, which is that the conversation about how do you develop things for people outside that 1% rarely happens and is very much needed.
One of the things that I think is happening on the media, in the media landscape around this is that the adoption of smartphones and the choice by many people, particularly communities of color, to access computing by way of the smartphone is eclipsing other populations. It's out of proportion in some ways, and I'd be interested, Jamal, to hear you talk a little bit about that. But when you plan for delivering information to people, and in public radio we've been giving a lot of thought to that. The opportunity is to meet people where they are, and in communities across the country, that opportunity is by meeting them on their mobile devices, on their tablets, on their smartphones. But are you saying that that's not ultimately going to produce the informed populace that we're after because of the broadband issue?
I think what it reflects is that when you're talking about the medium of using a phone, again, if you look at the data, the majority of communities of color are not necessarily using smartphones in that way. They're actually high users of text messaging. And text messaging doesn't reflect content per se. It means that the question is, where's the source of the content coming from? And so when you start to think about it from that perspective, I think a good case in point is the Chicago Tribune. As they were going through some financial difficulties and entering into bankruptcy, they started to outsource their local reporters, and in some cases getting reports from the Philippines. And so you can meet people where they are, but if the content and the source is not localized and is not reflecting what's happening in the communities, and the transparency and accountability needs are not actually being filtered, you know, you can get a text message from a reporter in the Philippines, but it's not benefiting you and your community. And so I think the discussion, again, has to go a little bit deeper than just meeting people where they are, but standing in the future and saying, where should this community be 5 to 10 years from now in terms of truly diversifying the space so that the ownership and the space at the table is not about me getting a text message because that's the only thing I have, but about the infrastructure that's going to support me to have access in my home and in my community, which is also an economic driver, a business driver, and really shifts the landscape.
So what's interesting to me is this brings up another key point for journalists, and particularly for news creators and publishers. You know, this notion of, as a journalist in sort of, you know, the old days of about, what, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, you know, there was circulation. I wrote something, it got in, it went out, right? Or I broadcast it, there's an audience there. But now we talk a lot, particularly for independent publishers, about the need to sort of, you know, write once, publish many. This, you know, the burden of getting content to where people are and allowing them to decide how to consume it is a very, very big deal. And I think that I understand people's nostalgia for paper. I really do. You know, I still get the paper, and I hope my kids will remember getting the paper, but they're not going to buy the paper probably in the future, right? This is a trend that has started, and from my perspective, if you look at investigative journalism in particular, you know, the pullback from investigative journalism from commercial media started well before the internet, right? So the fact is that our job as informers of the public, you know, we could stand and we could look back and we could lament the good old days. Or we could focus on the future and we could think about, okay, so now what do we do? And I think this communication, this conversation today should be about that, and not how do we get here or why are we here today.
And we jumped quickly from newspapers to smartphones. What about radio and television? I mean, you're talking about access and equity issues. I think we're past the point where having a television or a radio is a status symbol. I would think that somebody at NPR has a soft spot for some radio.
Well, yes, and you know, CEO came up with a phrase that I think actually works really well in this conversation. And as we, because radio has been pronounced dead any number of times over the years, as every new technology has come online. But what he says is, that radio isn't going anywhere; it's going everywhere. And it is a notion that if you can keep the values of both the craft and the depth of the journalism intact, and deliver it to people if they're consuming their news through earbuds and any other those devices that you might be holding in your hand, or listening to it on the radio, or listening to the internet on the car radio. However it is that they're consuming it, that you're providing ultimately the depth of content. And when you look at what WWNO is doing with its going news and information in town, it is additive for a community that needs to have the breadth and depth of reporting that we're talking about here. And whether or not you're getting that because you've clicked something on and listened to it by tuning to a particular place on a dial, or clicked something on your computer and got it out of the speaker there, it really doesn't matter as long as the content is there.
Yeah, I think, we're talking about content, and we're talking about a community's need for content, and I think we're missing one particular point, and that is that the community also, there's this challenge with the audience that those of us in journalism have struggled with for a long time, and that is that sometimes we create really, really great content, and we can't figure out how to get the audience to actually consume it. Now, part of that problem is because we don't package the content in a way that the audience actually wants to consume it. And increasingly, that means that that really great, long, investigative pieces cannot be just a lot of words. That they have to include video, that they have to include interactive graphics. But it also means that we have to be able to match the content to the consumer in the way that the consumer is used to getting information. So my children get most of their information from Facebook and Tumblr. And that is not an invalid way to consume information. They're actually pretty darned informed by doing that. But it means that somebody has to be putting content on Facebook and Tumblr that actually brings value to their lives. So it can't just be funny animated videos of Michael Phelps at the Olympics. It has to do more than that. And that's where the content creators, I think, have to get creative about how they get their content in front of the audience. And one of the challenges to that has been that there's traditionally been an economic model tied to content. So the reason that newspapers didn't want to embrace the internet is because they made money from that piece of paper that they delivered to your doorstep every day. And they can't make, the money that you can make on the internet does not equal the money that you can make in a printed paper. Now, as that decline has happened more rapidly than most people expected, the decline in revenue in newspapers, they've started to realize that they have to embrace the digital space, and suddenly the newspaper then becomes a hurdle or a wall to actually embracing the digital space, but when it gets back to the content, the most innovative content creators usually come not from traditional sources. And so what's really exciting about what I think will happen in New Orleans is that suddenly there will be much more creativity about the content that is created in service of the audience. That's my prediction.
And I would actually even go a little further than that and say that to some extent our language around a lot of journalism and media is a vestige of a sort of one-way broadcast era, speaking about the consumer and about content and sort of the way we frame the kind of information we want people to have in a civic world is is a vestige of a place in which, as the proprietor of an evening newscast or the proprietor of a newspaper, you had the ability to sort of make a bundle of goods and then go send it to everybody. And the assumption, and there wasn't very much data about it, was that everybody just sort of picked it up and absorbed all of it, which is false. And so part of what we see happening is that that model, it gets unbundled, and you realize that there are people who got the newspaper every day who only read the sports section primarily and maybe saw a couple of headlines or whatever. And that information is starting to sort of change, you know, what we know. And one of the things that becomes really interesting in that setting is that one of the things we see is that people who start to think about their consumers or their audience as a community versus continuing to speak about them as a consumers tend to have more success, or at least tend to be onto the right track or experimenting with interesting ideas. And like a great example of that is Homicide Watch in DC. Has anybody ever heard of that? It's a really interesting project in Washington, D.C., and basically their goal is to track every homicide that happens in Washington, D.C., a city in which there are too many. And basically what they do, the site isn't, you know, doesn't have a lot of whiz-bang technology on it or anything, but what they do is they essentially create a page for each homicide that happens and track the suspect, track the police work that goes on. And there's a woman, Laura Amico, who does a lot of this, who drives this site. And they basically create a page for each homicide and sort of track what happens as the police follow it. And it creates a space for the family to comment on, you know, and leave messages, and they sort of become these lasting pages about each event in a way that news organizations like newspapers typically haven't done, right? You would sort of run the content and then it would get archived. And they create this sort of lasting wall for each event. And the site isn't really fascinating technologically, but what they've done is they've built a community around this community that unfortunately is a very specific community in DC that experiences a lot of homicides. And it's journalism, but it's also community building, and it's also advocacy in its own way. And they've done a really fascinating thing. So I encourage you to check that out, because it's a fascinating example of sort of a random, tiny project that they started over a weekend, I think. Her husband is a developer, helped her build the site, and now it's really taken off.
And they, as I understand, they follow it all the way through adjudication.
They do,
so
yeah.
When they've arrested someone,
from beginning to whatever you would call the end in a situation.
And who does that? Who does that work? Because eventually you'd have too many homicides to track, right?
Yeah, well, right now it's them, and I think they have some volunteer help. But it's just the two of them, and then they have some volunteer help. But I mean, this is one of the questions: is like, how do you scale that up? But right, I mean, imagine the Washington Post, for example, has you know, many more people available to do that kind of work, but they don't do that.
Right.
You know, and I don't know that they would be the best people to do it. I'm not sure that they have interest in doing that. But there becomes a question about how do you scale that innovation, and I don't know the answer to that, but it's an interesting question to think about. And I know they've gotten inquiries from people in other cities about the same topic, and they've also gotten inquiries from people tracking other things, other topics, tracking other things, who want to use that same model to track those things. So it's spreading in some fashion.
And what's really interesting about that is, so I was at a daily newspaper when they decided to not cover every single homicide that happened in the city because there were too many of them. It was the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and it was the 1980s, and there were just too many homicides to cover. I think there were more than 300 in the year that I was there. And they decided that they just couldn't cover every homicide. And the story that was lost, because the homicides that they decided not to cover were the people who were the most marginalized people in society. And those were the homicides that they chose not to cover. And the story that was lost, I mean, it had nothing to do with the internet or technology or anything. It was just that it didn't fit their profit model at the time to cover every homicide. And they kept getting feedback from their readers that the readers didn't want to read about every homicide. But there certainly was a need to house that data somewhere and to document those stories. And so the fact that now that there are these tools that anybody can use, I mean, you could do that on a Facebook page if you had to, or you could do that on a Tumblr blog, or you could start your own WordPress site. You know, that wasn't possible in 1989 when I was in Cleveland, but it's certainly possible now. So there really is this ability for the community. When we started this project at Poynter, we had this idea that what would happen is the professional media would shrink. We were seeing lots and lots of reporters lose their jobs. This was 4 years ago. The professional media would shrink, and something would grow up in that vacuum. And we didn't know what it was, but you know, nature abhors a vacuum. Something would grow up there. And the fact is that's exactly what's happening.
I think, though, that one of the challenges that we have in our, sorry, Kevin.
No, go.
One of the challenges that we have in this moment in time in journalism is that my interest might take me to build a site like you've described, Christopher, but the community's need to know things is expansive. And the things that I may not be interested in, of course, won't get that kind of treatment at all. And as we look at the changes that are happening, both in terms of the business models of news organizations and the technological opportunities that are created, we still have the fundamental question to be asked, and that is, are we in fact informing people about all of the things that they need to know across this community in a way that gives the community an opportunity to solve problems, to recognize problems, to seize on opportunities, and to grow? And I think that we are more and more challenged, in fact, by some of the directions that our technology is taking us, to give that sense of community by providing that broad coverage. And I don't know that the problem that I've described negates any of the efforts that are underway. It doesn't rebut the idea that we should be doing a number of the things that we're doing, focusing, for example, on investigative journalism. But I think that we have to keep restating the fact that as these changes take place, we can't allow the 10,000-foot view of our communities to be lost.
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100%. I mean, I think, and Chris touched upon a point, the unbundling of the newspaper. And to your point about want versus need, I mean, I live in LA. Sorry, I do. And in LA, they're very interested in entertainment and sports, pretty much what most people are in America, right? So box office gets a lot of play, and the Lakers get a lot of play. But the fact is that the enterprise investigative journalism, the coverage of City Hall, the issues that actually help people become informed aren't the pages that get read the most and aren't the pages that get the most clicks. So, but as it relates to investigative journalism in particular, which are long projects, up to 6 months long, very, very expensive. Not every story pans out, right? You seek truth, and if the data doesn't play it out, then there it is. So the model when you unbundle changes. And now, and this is why I think this is a critical factor here when you're looking at a diverse ecosystem and media environment like New Orleans. But the ability to put investigative reporting where the audience is on topics that they need to know and excite them by presenting that information in multiple formats actually is an opportunity to reach people in ways they've never been reached before. So, for example, we're part of an initiative right now through the Center for Investigative Reporting in Berkeley to work with YouTube to create an investigative news channel called the iFiles. And you can go there right now and you can see. So here we have a new format, really, which is online video. So, it can be 6 minutes long, it can be 7, it can be 32 minutes long. There's no sort of set rules around this. But what we're trying to do here is reach new audiences with investigations and throw them to perhaps a news application, a text report, maybe multiple text reports localized from different communities. And now all of a sudden, what we're able to do to the technology point, which you could not do through a traditional newspaper or a broadcast. But again, the issue is this: putting the content where the audience is with information that they need.
I want to go back to, I think, a point that's been raised a few times, this notion of community, and as we've talked about it, like how our children are connected to accessing media. The question for the New Orleans community is, what community are we talking about, and who in particular? If you think about the demographic shifts, since Hurricane Katrina, the Latino population in the city has doubled. The children of that community in that community is vastly different than, say, 7, 8 years ago. Who's servicing that community, and how are they included in this process and in this dialogue? And so, I don't want to be devoid of the business concept, but at the end of the day, the demographic shifts, not only in this country, but in this city, are also going to shape how news and media and ownership and access gets dealt with. And so we see in different cities across the country, different approaches to this. I'm thinking of in Haverhill, Massachusetts, there's a cooperative that's happening where the community has said, we're going to own our own website. We're going to ignore the IRS because they're having issues trying to give us, you know, sort of 501c3 status. And so we're going to own our own sort of cooperative. But then the challenges are who's going to populate the news, who's going to generate the content, and who is the community. And so as we start to wrestle with this notion again of inclusion, here in New Orleans, I think, and I've heard this a lot since I've been here, that race and ethnicity bubble under the surface. But it's very salient here. And then you add class, you're talking about different populations and communities, and not one single outlet or one single paper is going to service a community holistically. And so I think as you think about the debate and the discussion, there's a business element, there's a policy element, and then there's a community solutions element. And in some ways, all three of them have to work in cohort in order to make sure that the communities, plural, are being serviced properly.
Well, certainly there are aspects of this city that didn't shed a tear when the announcement of the Times-Picayune was made. And there are others that the Lens partners with Fox 8 television, and just the words Fox in front of that will mean some people might not be interested in watching that for preconceived notions. How do we, and this is a question for the audience, make sure that we reach out to those audiences and let them know that things are changing, new outlets are being invented, the existing outlets are eager to hear what we have to say and are interested in reinventing themselves. What are the tips?
Well, events like this are a good start. I mean, I think that what's interesting about the notion of a news organization is now in the sort of independent nonprofit space, community events that actually bring thought leaders in and actually have input from folks, create relevance, create marketing opportunities, create revenue opportunities, but more importantly, gives that ability to have input. I mean, to Chris's point earlier, we're well past the one-way media organization. And I think embracing that and understanding that so that people feel empowered is a good first step.
I think you also involve the education system. I mean, most schools have some form of media that they create, a student newspaper, a student website, and in most cases they're woefully inadequate.
Are you talking about K-12, higher ed?
Both. But certainly, you know, middle school and high school. And most of the time they are. I mean, I work with journalism. I work with journalism teachers in a lot of different places, and most of the time, what they're working with and what they're able to do is just woefully inadequate. But you could certainly involve the education system and bolster that. And when you do that, you're doing two things. One is you're creating an appetite for news. Because when you get students to actually engage in the creation of news, they start to understand what it is and how it serves the community. But then you're also creating content. What's amazing is that when student journalists when they hit the nail on the head, they do some amazing stuff. And the fact is that schools need to be held accountable anyway, right? That our school systems in any community are some of the systems that the citizens are most worried about in terms of their performance. So I think that if you start, or if you have a major component be the education system, in terms of creating and understanding the ecosystem, I think you create immediate payoff and you create a long-term payoff as well.
Well, that's the second time you've come back to creative new ways to produce news. And earlier, I was talking with Chris, and he put me on the spot and made me think, and I hate it when that happens. And I said, well, people are out there saying that I get my news from Facebook, or I get my news from The Daily Show, or from Colbert, or who reads the world's finest news source, The Onion, right? And he said, what's wrong with that? And like I said, it made me think. I'd like you to, what's right with that? What's right with getting your news from somebody who is satirical and biting and has an obvious opinion about something?
Well, one of the things I find really interesting about that is that when you look at the data about who watches The Daily Show or the Colbert Report or The Onion, that those actually tend to be some of the better informed people in society, and tend to be better educated people also. So I think the idea that there's a large proportion of particularly young people who are only consuming The Daily Show and nothing else is probably misleading, partially because to get most of the humor on those shows and like to get the satire of The Onion, you have to understand what the root thing was about. Otherwise, I mean, and there are people who do this who read those, read the Onion articles and think they're actual news articles. So I think it's, at some level, the idea that there's a large population of people who are doing that is misleading. But what I think is also interesting about it is that it demonstrates that people are willing to interact with serious or civic things in contexts that are not purely serious or civic. And like we were talking earlier about, vegetables and this notion of, and this comes along with the sort of one-way medium aspect of it, which is that, we have a bundle of serious goods which are important to you as a citizen, and you should eat it like medicine and sort of be grateful for it, even though it doesn't taste good. And that's sort of coming apart, right? So you see there's a whole population of people who are willing to sit down every day for half an hour or an hour and watch a show that makes fun of current events, and in the process think about current events while also laughing. And that's great, because it means that we're finding out that people are willing to do that. And that means that, okay, great, so if I'm over here in this particular geographic community, maybe there's a portion of people who really like satire as a way to interact with news about New Orleans. And so let's go do something for them, or whatever the sort of idea is. But I think what's cool about it is it's more of that unbundling. It says there's a way to do civically valuable things that aren't necessarily buttoned down, things that require you to be solemn about everything, because nobody likes that. It's just not the way people prefer to live their lives.
Kind of a drag.
So we've been talking about this, and it's really a topic I think people are referring to increasingly as news literacy, right? This idea of helping people understand, look, ask questions. Where's this coming from? What's the source? Is there transparency behind it? News literacy, I think, is a very important issue from the earliest ages. However, some of the people that are teaching news literacy are themselves biased based upon their personal experience. So it's very important to, there's a lot of, is this truly journalism? The answer is, does it matter, right? What's, I think, more important is, who is the source? What is the motivation behind the source? Is that information verifiable? What kind of ethics are behind this? Not necessarily the medium by which it comes through.
Well, now it gets to the part where we gathered for a purpose tonight, and that's to hear from the audience and to offer thoughts to the various news directors, editors, producers who are here tonight or watching on the live stream. You should know as well, this is going to be archived probably on the Lenses site, as well as the New Orleans Coalition on Open Governance's website. That is nocog.org. I've got two folks with roving microphones. Jessica Williams is at my left. Tom Gogola here is to the right. Raise your hands. They'll be walking the aisles, and if you could meet them at the end of your aisle once they point to you, we will get off and running. Jessica, you go first.
I go first. Is there a future for the panel? Is there a future for newspapers in this country? And the second part of that is there a city comparable in size and what New Orleans represents where a newspaper is doing what the Times-Picayune is doing with this city? In other words, ceasing to be a daily and going to 3 times a week. Thank you.
I guess I want to take a shot at the second question. And I think that this is the largest city in which that's happened thus far. But as Kelly said, I don't think it will be the last city of this size where it's happened. I'm a newspaper person, born and raised, and love the idea of having that newspaper in my hands. But like Kevin, my kids have never been newspaper readers, and I don't expect that they ever will. So I can see the future in that way. At the same time, my oldest children, when they consume news, are consuming it looking for the credible, verifiable, fact-based reporting that has been the hallmark of newspapers. So if they find that online, then they're still holding the values of journalism that I grew up with.
And
Sure, there will be, some newspapers will survive. I don't think that there will be as many newspapers as there are now. And I think the bigger concern is that there will be communities that don't get their information needs met. And I think that's and newspapers represent a substantial part of that ecosystem right now in the United States and really throughout the world. I mean, newspapers tend to have. So there's a difference between the daily newspaper being printed and delivered to your door and the largest staff of journalists in a community. And what you're also mourning is the reduction of that staff. Because that's actually more of a threat to your ability to govern yourselves than the printed newspaper being delivered to your doorstep. And it does remain to be seen how much capacity will be left. And
there are a couple of settings where I think the print product, I mean, including magazines, but is likely to persist. I mean, one of the places where this is particularly true in internationally more than in the U.S., but is like the free daily that's handed out in subways or something like that. Those are very popular, and the take-up rate on those is really, really high. So that's like a place where you can't. What do you replace that with digitally in a subway station where there's no internet or whatever? So there are places where the print product still makes sense, I think. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I think the reporting is the main question, but the other question is what happens to print as a product, because like the broadsheet newspaper probably doesn't make sense in a lot of context, but the idea of sort of something that comes the day after and is a little bit longer form than what you read on the internet is still valuable. I mean, I was interviewing a guy in France one time. I did a little research project on UK and French young people's news habits, and I was just asking him sort of how do you read the news, or when do you read the news most? And he's like, I read it in the morning and in the evening on the subway to and from school. And he was like, I'd love to read Le Monde, the French newspaper, but it's broadsheet. And he gets it out, and he's like, I can't read this on the subway because to read it, it's like this wide, and the subway is crowded. And so he's gotten a way to read it. And so he picks up this other newspaper, which is a tabloid, and he's like, this is what I read because it's small, and I can open it. And so there's like a whole set of things around that aren't really related to like the civic quality of the work, but that are kind of weird about the print product. And so how those things evolve, I think, is really important also.
Sorry.
And I think what we have to consider, though, is, and I'm not to... I don't want to kill the nostalgia of the days of newspapers, but when readership is shrinking and the economic drivers are shifting to a digital platform, I think from a policy perspective and a business perspective, we as a community have to be in tune with those shifts. I live in New York City, and on the subways now they're putting in digital monitors that show news. And most people I'm seeing on the trains are using their tablets. And so when you start to think about the evolution of the technology, the question is, what is in it for the communities versus the business community? And the FCC right now is actually in the game, but they're trying to figure it out. It's like the days of old when they were trying to figure out what to do with AT&T and telephone lines. They're trying to figure out what to do in terms of regulating this new enterprise that actually is in many ways replacing and outpacing print paper. It's why we're actually here, is because in many ways the Time Picker unit is saying they're going on an online format more so than a hard copy printed format. But what does that actually mean? And so I think from my perspective, the real questions are how do you start to involve yourselves in the conversations from the policy aspects and the investment aspects, because at the end of the day, there will be an evolution. And the question is, where is this community? Is it going to be on the front end of that evolution or on the tail end? And I'm hoping it'll be on the front end.
Yeah, to answer your question, I think also a slightly different way is I think that what we're seeing here is that print will continue at two levels, probably not in the mainstream, but either at the high end, so Barron's, Wall Street Journal, people who can afford subscriptions to that, it's not an issue and they're able to do that, right? But there are also things like within our network, we have the SF Public Press in San Francisco, which is a $1 community newspaper which has zero advertising because they believe that advertising somehow compromises their content. We also have Philadelphia, the Notebook, which is a purely focused on the school district in Philadelphia and is handed out to teachers and educators and parents, excuse me. So you're seeing sort of like a move away from the middle. So what that really effectively means is the notion that the newspaper is the predominant form by which people get their news is what we're lamenting. But print as a format will continue.
Tom, who you got over there?
Firstly, I love your suit.
Seersucker rocks.
Do you go to sipping in seersucker? Oh. Anyway.
I don't understand your question.
His suit kind of made me think of New Orleans is a city of very deep and strong cultural roots. I don't think anybody could argue that. And I think part of the anger that people have about the Times-Picayune wanting to downsize their paper is that people can't get their recipes on Thursday. They can't get their historical pictures. They can't get their living section. They can't get their pictures of Drew Brees, although they did say they'd print after the games, which is strange to me. But anyway, do you think that entertainment, historical, and cultural pieces could be left behind in the new age of digital formats and broader cultural spectrums?
Well, one example of this actually is in Philadelphia, which is the home to the Media Mobilizing Project. And it's actually a collection of individuals who are telling community stories online, in part because the traditional media outlets aren't capturing the voices of the communities. And so you're seeing that many communities are starting to respond to the downsizing of print newspapers by figuring out solutions that capture the voice of the communities. I can think of in Detroit, there's the Digital Justice Coalition, which is actually going in and training community members on how to be storytellers, how to leverage online spaces, and how to really innovate in terms of becoming news agents themselves. But I think the setback, though, and just to be candid, is that it becomes a full-time endeavor, if you will. And so do communities have the capacity to sustain that long term? And that's a real question mark. Because at the end of the day, you don't have a person that's being paid to provide that sort of cultural insight and to capture that history. And so is it fair, if you will, for the burden to be shifted to the public? And then the real questions start to, and again, I'm a policy guy, so it goes into policy. A lot of these companies are business enterprises. And so when we talk about culture and sharing stories and community building, if it's not profitable, sometimes that's going to be what's on the cutting floor, the editing floor. And so I think it's a real struggle and a question that communities have to start to answer is where should that be housed? Is it about the public interest or is it driven by the market? And what you're articulating is that there's a gap there. And the question is, how do you fill that gap?
Another response to that would be if you take it from the user perspective, right? So one of the problems with search is you have to know what you're looking for, right? Or at least to have an idea of what you would like to find, or you're relying on, just get lucky with Google. That's where brands come into play, right? I mean, trusted brands. So we talk about quality of news, but we also talk about the gravitas of a brand. So, we talk about the Times-Pic, we talk about NOLA.com, but the fact is that one of the biggest problems we have as a movement in the nonprofit space, and I should say, by the way, that the Lens is a member of INN, I should have said that up front, is that we're not brands that are very well known, right? So to your point, we have an extra burden of trying to put that content where people are, as opposed to get them to come to where we are. And that means also we have to work harder, and the end user has to work harder. When you get when you go out your paper's in the driveway and you pick it up, once you make that subscription purchase choice, there's very little work for you as an end user to have to do, or as a reader to have to do. Now, there's a lot more burden, and I think that that's something that everyone's a little worried about, because to what extent will people go out of their way to get informed?
Jessica?
I want to follow up on what you just said about brands and ask all of you, any of you, to help me understand how civic engagement, how the common good is supported when everyone needs to be their own editor. When I'm reading Facebook postings that support what I already believe, and I realize this is happening in cable television networks and in radio, AM radio, etc. But if all of us have the responsibility to be our own editors, and there's no one vetting the news in that brand that respected brand that you're talking about. How do we stop just subdividing into more and more balkanized subdivisions?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to say here that there are still news organizations doing exactly what you've described, including the Times-Picayune. You have public radio in town. You have the commercial television stations in town, commercial radio in town. And so to a certain extent, we can't continue on imagining that all of that's gone. The fact of the matter is that with the opportunities that are made available technologically, there's more opportunity for people to do what you've described. The burden doesn't fall totally to the public to come up with your own news. I think, in fact, the burden, particularly for nonprofits and for public media, is to step in at every opportunity, bring brand recognition, bring credibility, and bring the values that underlie them to that task. If in the end, though, some of the concerns that the young woman mentioned a moment ago are lost because one institution stopped covering a particular thing, it doesn't mean that it's lost totally to the community. I think that we recognize the challenges that exist if you ask the public to carry that burden ad infinitum. But I also think we're mistaken if we think that it simply ends with the ceasing of publication of a printed product 4 days out of the week.
We seem to keep coming back to this idea of almost boutique journalism. Everybody has their own niche. One time you went to the butcher or you went to the candlestick maker to get what you needed rather than to a general store. But if a bunch of butchers show up all at once, I think her question is, how do you know who to trust? You know, how long is it going to take? How long does the public have? How much patience do they have to determine, yeah, that one's worth reading and that one, you know, I don't know.
You know what the irony of that is that the trust of the professional media is at the lowest level that it's ever been. So these brands, I mean, it's measured. Yeah. Yeah. It's measured. Gallup measures it, and
public radio is still very high.
Yes, you are. It's true. Okay. Right. Do we want to talk numbers though? Because we're still talking below 50.
Very high.
Yeah, very high. Exactly, compared to 21%.
15, 16%. Same as Congress.
So the thing is. We lost him.
Go ahead.
So the thing,
all right, Keith, no more NPR.
Yeah, you started that.
That's it, we're leaving.
But the thing is that, you know, the demise of brand journalism, well, first of all, I don't think that brand journalism will go away. I think that there will always be brands that you trust, and sometimes you will trust them because they deliver something that reflects your philosophical viewpoint, and sometimes you'll trust them because they deliver information that you know to be accurate because you have some sort of intimate knowledge of the subject, and sometimes you'll trust them because they're entertaining or they're engaging in a way that nobody else is. So trust is always evolving, and it always was. I mean, the more choices that we have, the less we trust any one choice, and that's just a fact of the media environment now, because the trust actually started to decline. As our choices began to expand, which wasn't the internet, it was actually cable TV that sort of coincided with the decline in the trust of media. So
I'll actually pile on to this. There's another issue here, which is, unfortunately, this also means that the ability for people to manipulate the public has increased. I mean, I was recently at a conference in Ohio State, and you know, we're talking about the number of State House reporters and the number of PR people that are outnumbering them on an 8-to-1 basis. So when you have 8 flags I still like to use that word, 8 flags for every reporter, and they're writing content and they're handing it over, and it's being put on websites, and citizens are reading it, not knowing what the source is, not knowing that this was not independently validated. We have a much bigger problem when it comes to that, and that's why, you know, the professionals in the room and the people who are focused on this issue, that's why we've got to step up even more. And it's hard, but that's what's at stake.
But I also think we have to consider the fact that if your sole filter for your news and your political perspectives is one newspaper, then you also have a problem. And so when you think about the plurality of voices, it's a tough balance in that you want credible, fact-based research and information, but the plurality of voices also contributes to a changing demographic and in many ways the growth of our communities and our society. And so I've heard people debate that, you know, my voice is not reflected in the New York Times. My voice is not reflected in the Washington Post. And so the real question also becomes is how do you make sure that you're elevating other voices through other sources so that the debate is rigorous and rich and you're really having a dialectic progress. And so I think on the flip side, this also opens up an opportunity for inclusion in a different way. Otherwise, you only have one voice, one source, one filter, and a community that thrives off of just that, I think, is not a vibrant community.
But let me just say one thing, right? So, you know, you hear a lot of people who are sort of on the Fox News channel a lot, and people are trusting their friends and their relatives a lot more than trusting professional journalists. So if Joe and Bob both watch Fox News and tell me this is the truth, it must be the truth, right? The problem is that most citizens don't go out of their way to make sure they're getting plurality of voices. So this goes back to the issue of news literacy.
And the only thing I would add to that is, we spent a lot of time on this question, but no one has solved this problem yet, right? Yeah. So the one thing that the bundled newspaper had that we haven't figured out yet, or the bundled newspaper may have had, right? And we're not, the data on that is not, from 50 years ago, is not awesome. But is that if you picked up the newspaper to get to the sports section or wherever you were going, you happened across things you weren't expecting, and there's a serendipity to that, which there also is on radio, which there also is on, it's not that those things have gone away, right? I mean, to your point, like, they're still there, but that's either been reduced or for some people has been eliminated. And no one's figured out what the new serendipity machine is or whatever. It's a problem that people are actually thinking about, is like, what's the serendipity engine of the future? So if you have ideas about it, you should work on them, because nobody's solved this problem.
And quickly, the quick discussion down here was about WWNO and their format. And within the past 2 weeks, they have changed to less classical music during the day and more NPR and talk radio. Just briefly before the next question, you may have grabbed a survey on your way in. Certainly when you get home, you can mail it back. It would be a lot easier if you went ahead and answered a few of those questions now and dropped them off in some boxes that will be available on the corners. Tom? Here you go.
So underlying this discussion is the core question of how do we get accountability for the information from all these vast sources, and especially in the context of for-profit media, where in reality, whoever is engaging, reading, watching, listening to that source is the product, and the people who are advertising and paying are really the consumers. So, you know, it's almost like it's in the interest of, as we become more specialized in these media, for any one medium to really latch onto a perspective and guarantee an audience to the people who are going to pay for that medium. So how do we get accountability under all of this?
Well, the assumption there, of course, is that the people aren't going to pay for the content. And I'm a big believer that ultimately, you know, when I think of nonprofits, I think of this as being, you know, we're public media. I mean, PBS, NPR, and these nonprofits that we form. And ultimately, I think this is, the burden falls on the people that read the content to subsidize the content, not the advertisers. You know, that was a function of a bundle. That was a function of a Victorian notion. And it's lasted a long time, but I'm not sure I agree with that question, personally.
And I think from, again, a policy perspective, when we start to look into what's happening on the internet, again, the FCC and others are there in theory to really promote localism and information for the public interest. But I don't believe that that's happening fully, because I don't think the public is necessarily holding that entity and other entities like them accountable. And so when you talk about transparency and accountability, and this may seem unpopular to some, there's a burden that falls on the consumer. There's a burden that falls on you that sit in these seats. And the question really becomes, how do you involve yourself and your communities and other like-minded individuals to start asking those pressing questions of where is our local news, where is our local outlet, and how is that being supported and provided for from a policy perspective? Because from a business perspective, a business can say, it's not profitable, we're not going to do it, we're folding. But from a public policy perspective, that answer is not good enough because we pay taxes and we have laws and legislators, et cetera. And so I think you have to also invert it to think about who is a part of your accountability stream, and that's the community and lawmakers who are connected to regulating this type of industry.
I think something I'm most concerned about is not necessarily a result of the digital revolution. It was something that had actually begun before, and it just seems to be getting worse, and I'm just wondering where are the opportunities, either technically or in some other way, in terms of how the media reshapes itself, that we're going to go back to, or at least go forward with, some sense of outrage over things that are really scary, wrong policies, developments. We've lived in New Orleans since Katrina through some incredible change, and some of it really good, and some of it pretty atrocious. And there has been really a total lack of outrage in our media, whether it's broadcast, print, digital, whatever, over some of these developments. I'm still trying, as a lot of people know, to get over the demolition of thousands of units of public housing. Right now, I'm watching houses being torn down street by street as if this is some kind of real solution to blight, not just a repetition of the geography of Detroit. I mean, we just have policies that are very wrong-headed and no outrage. Where was the outrage over the demise of the Times-Picayune in New York, where the Newhouse family is based? I didn't see a word in the Times-Picayune. I saw one Lukovich cartoon the other day. It was the first time I saw any outrage about that. There's very little outrage in general, it seems to me, or less than when I grew up with the New York Post, the old Post, not the Murdoch Post, but the liberal New York Post that I grew up with in the Bronx, that was outraged over things. And so you would get a sense of, you might not agree, but you would say, wow, gee, maybe I better be outraged about this, and you learn through it and you progress. So how is that going to evolve? Are we going to come? Is that going to survive? Is that going to happen? And,
do you want your media outlet to be outraged and bringing
if I can just add one thing about, in New Orleans, we get very outraged over political corruption. And it's a good thing to be outraged about, but it's not the only thing to be outraged about. And quite frankly, most of the investigative journalism going on here, whether it's on television or in print or online, is about corruption and not about policy issues that are devastating to thousands and thousands of our citizens.
So, you know, I actually think there's more outrage today than there used to be. And I think if you look at like change.org and, you know, 1.5 million signatures about Trayvon Martin within 2 weeks, kind of forcing the Sanford Police Department in Florida to investigate that case criminally, or you look at the Facebook uprising against the Susan G. Komen Foundation when they withdrew support for Planned Parenthood. So what I think has happened actually is that the burden of outrage has shifted, because you're right. I don't sense that you have that sort of editorial fist on the desk outrage from a lot of our publications. For a number of reasons. Business-wise, that's alienating, and so there's a business reason that they don't do that. But also, I think because there are other voices to do that, and there are other tools and mechanisms for doing that in various communities. And you know, when you say where's the outrage in New York, you guys, it's really, the conversation here in New Orleans is really loud about what's happening. So you may not be hearing it from the outside, but it was actually the New York Times that broke the story about the Times-Picayune, and people are talking about it a lot. I mean, like my dad asked me what was going on, and that's my benchmark. If my dad knows about something in Charleston, South Carolina, then it's getting through.
And not to put too much pressure on the panel or the audience, but as we discussed earlier at lunch, the the eyes of certainly the journalism community are on New Orleans to see how this plays out as a major daily newspaper cuts back. And the eyes of the world are on us to see how we react to that, both as news gatherers and producers and as a community. And I think that Kelly is right that our voices are carrying far and wide.
And there's just one quick thing I would encourage you to check out if you're interested in this. There's an emerging, it's been around for a while, but there's an emerging thing around like solutions journalism that some people are calling it. The idea just that some news organizations should be more focused on trying to think about, you know, what's next. And so like if I'm covering the recession, instead of focusing on people who are destitute and have nothing, focusing on places or examples where there's some lesson that can be gleaned, even if it's really tiny, and how do you scale that or whatever. So that's an emerging thing that people are talking about, and there's lots of stuff out there about it. But it's one angle on your question.
Good evening. Hi, I'm Fina Robinson-Mock, and I'm the executive director of a group, Kids Rethink New Orleans Schools, and our young people rely a lot on youth-led news conferences to get the word out. So we're definitely interested in what's going on with the future of media. My question is, does a newspaper that moves its content online have an obligation to provide subscribers with devices, either free or financed, in the same way that cable subscribers are provided with cable boxes?
It's a very interesting question, and the short answer is no. But the long answer is that question is a debatable one that has to be really informed by the public, meaning constituents, voters, et cetera, and what does that look like? And so, again, I kept bringing up the FCC. The FCC is actually the player in that space around cable and online access, et cetera. And so the question really becomes, are there policy solutions that will bridge the gap so that if we were to go to a more digitized format, an online format, can you provide a bridge for communities that don't currently have the infrastructure or the access through policies? Of course. But those ideas will come from many of you sitting in this room. And the pressure points will come from all of you sitting in this room. And so I think as we think about it from that perspective, it's actually where the innovation begins, is asking those questions. Because not only do you shift the business enterprise, but you shift the public good and the public interest from a policy perspective.
I'll also say the data on this generally says that kids who read or look at or engage with news at home or at school from young ages are more likely, you know, not surprisingly, to be engaged with that content later on. So from some level of like thinking about your business 20 years in the future, you know, depending on what kind of business you want, I mean, there is some imperative around trying to make sure that, you know, really, really tiny people are thinking about your content or have access to it so that when they become people who have money, they can give it to you. I mean, so there's something around that.
iPads for everyone.
Where did Jessica go? There we are.
Hi. One of the problems with moving from paper to digital for some of our local audience is that our main paper does not curate, or at least properly curate, the comment sections. And so I noticed that, as you can hear the murmurs, and so we have a really vile commenting community, unfortunately, and depending on which paper you go to and which site you go to, the editorial policy on that is different. And so I'm curious to hear from you, what trends do you see happening with online publications in terms of the stands that they take on commenters? I just read recently where there's a paper on the East Coast that is now requiring people to register their real names before they can log on comments. And I'm just wondering, so what trends are you seeing, and what can the community do to put pressure on these publications to be better about curating the comment sections?
So I don't have good news for you on this. There was recently a member of our organization that was experiencing some, you know, poorly worded, vile comments. And so they basically, you know, they were trying to keep up. They were writing stories and they were catching, and they couldn't keep up with the comments fast enough. So they decided to try turning off the comments. And some foundations that gave them money because this was about being a public vehicle said, if you don't have the public able to comment, we're going to pull our funding.
But There are many, the trend is actually to go toward making people identify themselves. And you can do that through a lot of different ways. But the easiest way is to do it through Facebook registration. And one of the really interesting things about it is Facebook comments actually work, right? People don't act like jerks on Facebook for the most part. And that's because... Not...
Yeah.
They act like jerks on Facebook.
Not your friends.
I think we might have to all ask Kelly what her Facebook name is so we can all friend her. You know.
It's my name.
I'm going to rebut that as well, which is to say that anonymity in comments and whistleblowers still has validity. And when you shut off anonymity, you also shut off a part of the community that wouldn't participate.
So the best solution that I've seen to that is the Las Vegas Journal, which requires, they have a two-tiered system for comments. So they require people, if you want your comment to show up underneath the story right away, you have to be identified. But then if you want to make an anonymous comment, they sort of have a different place for the anonymous comments. And it's kind of like a comment ghetto because it's really hard to get there, and not very only the bad people go there. But what they do is then they curate those comments, so they will go through, and the editors will go through, and if there are good comments there, they will then move those over. So they leave all the racist stuff and all the sexist stuff and all the crazy ads that people put on the comment sections. They leave that over in the place that nobody goes to, and they pull the good stuff out that's left anonymously.
But also, putting on my organizer hat, there are organizations that deliberately plan and strategize around what comments and how to flood comments, not only in local articles, on national articles. You know, I've come out of national organizing that internationally we were looking at these strategies and having people comment on certain articles. So it ends up being, again, this notion of censorship versus freedom of expression. Because it's anonymous and it's online, it's how do you balance that out? And I think, again, and I'm really being community-centric here, is that if you live in this community and you read something that's really good and you see vile comments, part of the impetus is for you to comment. Because what still matters is that, you know, at least statistically, if you write a letter, for example, to a local publication or to a local elected official, they code you statistically as representing anywhere from 300 to 1,000 people. And so you have to figure out how to elevate your voice in the face of these vile and nasty comments that you may deem are deplorable, because at the end of the day, the question is, do you ever want your comment to be in the comment ghetto? And so it's a trade-off, and I think we have to just think about what that means as it relates to how we, again, think about policy and strategy.
And there are probably 20 best practices that people who host news sites can use to make comments better. And I teach a whole course on that. And getting rid of anonymity is just one of them. But you can, I mean, when the editors or the people who host the site actually participate in the comments, people tend to behave better, and you tend to see an elevated level of conversation. When there's photos with the comments, people tend to act better. When there's a lot of white space around the comments, there's ways to design it that elevate the conversation. So there's a lot of things that websites can do, and you can pressure the people who run the websites that you use to employ those practices.
And I want to get to that point from my own experience, and it puts the burden back on the news organization, that when I've answered commenters on stories that I've been involved with, it really knocks them back on their heels. Like, they're used to just shouting into the wilderness and having this comment go up, and then they check back and they realize someone's answered them. And then invariably you get kind of, oh, sorry about that, I didn't really mean part of that comment. And I would commend NOLA.com and the Times-Picayune for moving toward that subset of some of the changes that they're making. I believe the intent is to get the reporters and authors more involved in those comments, and that leads to this kind of community engagement that we're seeking to have.
The other thing I'd say is there are some people who are thinking about moving that whole space out of, like, where it's, you know, there's there's again sort of a one-way medium thing. There's an article, and then below it there's people's comments, and they're sort of down there at the bottom. And there's Quora is a question and answer site that started up, and there's a startup in San Francisco called Branch that's trying to work on sort of commenting and conversation. There's a lot of people trying to hack at the edges of like, how do you make conversation online better and outside the context, or at least sort of adjacent to the context of journalism with a capital J. And I think some of those lessons, eventually once that space learns more, can be ported back into news, because there's a whole role for online conversation, obviously, that goes on Reddit or that goes on Facebook or on Twitter that isn't happening in journalism that matters to journalism, and a lot of discussion about news content that happens outside of the news website that's important. So nobody's figured that out yet, but there's a bunch of people eating at the edges of that, and somebody will get it right. What's that?
Is upvote, downvote, like Reddit does, the way they answer the comment problem?
It's one tool. It's one tool. He's talking about when you can vote a comment up, and so then it goes to the top of the list of comments.
Unfortunately, with that, you can get voices shouted out, right? Where you basically, if you have a story that's kind of loaded on one way, but people are talking reason on the other, they get shouted down, so that it basically suppresses their voices. So,
Tom?
Yeah, so two quick things. One, I think to the question about outrage earlier, I mean, I think one of the dangers of, the Colbert and, those kinds of shows is that they actually, like, the real violence that's happening to people becomes the punchline, right? So I think that we lose the sort of sense of outrage if people are kind of engaging in news. So, ha, funny what some politician said about, drone attacks or whatever, but we're not actually talking about drone attack, you know what I mean? So like part of the danger of that is that the sort of violence is lost in a joke. So one point, one thing I want to ask a question about is about actual reporting, right? We've talked a lot about sort of technology, and as a freelance, writer, and have covered specifically, a lot of health and specifically HIV-related stories, and seeing that really, other than the International AIDS Conference, really disappear from the U.S. in terms of domestic work, and having stories just flat out like kind of turned down by publications because nobody cares about AIDS anymore. I guess my question is, it's not even about just HIV as an issue, but about, I guess, just seeing less of the sort of, tennis back and forth, and more kind of in-depth reporting, and sort of how, the business model shifting has like actually just undermined the beat reporter and reporters who really sort of understand issues in complex ways, and don't just report, oh, this person said this and this person said that, but doesn't tell you whether that's a damn lie or not, right? Or the context behind what they say. And so I would like to just, if folks could respond to the sort of changes in actual, like the quality and the sort of depth of reporting that we're seeing in some new ways that's being managed.
There's one anecdote I heard recently that's sort of secondhand, but that apparently for a long period of time in Tennessee there was no reporter at the Supreme Court for months. There was just sort of nobody there. And just as a sign of, so one of the major changes, right, is that there are a lot of things that aren't being reported on at all. And so there's a huge need there, right, in terms of how do you track those things? And alongside the question of, are reporters sort of doing less work by just sort of saying he said, she said, and doing less on the groundwork, I wonder if you can't leverage that and, use that opportunity to cover the things that are sort of that are absent now, because there's a lot that is absent. And that was the scary finding of the FCC report on information needs of communities, is that even beyond changes in sort of big headline political coverage that are frightening, the major concern is sort of what happens when whole institutions go uncovered by anyone. Yeah. And I don't have any answers to that.
Well, one of the things that you do is, what you're suggesting is that you make choices. You determine in some ways, and I think it's one of the values of having a conversation with your community. You make choices about which things, in fact, you're going to give that kind of time and attention to, so that you're not spreading yourself. There's never a really good justification. There's no justification for the he said, she said kind of journalism that you're talking about. Depth reporting ought to be the norm. It ought to be It ought to be the universal standard. But if you've got to make choices then, do I cover the Supreme Court? Do I cover state government in the way that a lot of public radio stations are doing now to fill a void? And if I do that, then do I report vertically? Do I go down deep into this subject area? That's the kind of choice that you have to make. And in a lot of ways, the public has to demand it in a commercial space because I'm going to give you what I think you want otherwise. In the public media space, it is in fact it's the mission of the nonprofit organizations to do that, and the public, as represented by the people who are giving money for that effort, are speaking always about whether they want that.
So within our nonprofit movement, we have a few organizations that are vertically focused, not just community focused, right? So Kaiser Health News, Connecticut Health, Florida Health News, and Women's E-News being four of them. Women's E-News focusing on women's issues. That, they formed that organization because women's health issues were being grossly underreported in commercial media. So, are they well read? Can you get paid as a freelancer? Those are other issues. But the fact is there are outlets that are trying to bring focus to areas that are not being found elsewhere too.
Right, but I don't think they make up the gap yet. I mean, because something like 30,000 professional reporters have lost their jobs in the last 5 years. And so there's just, the gap between what you used to get and what you get now is significant. I mean, you can go in, like a city like Indianapolis used to have like 8 education reporters, and they covered different school districts and some covered higher education, and now they have 1. So obviously that community does not get education news the way it used to. And health is a great example because it takes a fair amount of expertise, right? If you really want good health reporting, you're not going to get it from an amateur. You have to figure out a way to pay that person. And the economic model that used to pay them doesn't exist anymore.
And what is also interesting in this debate is that you're dealing with economics. That plain and simple is really what we're talking about. And when you start to think about it from that standpoint, what is the incentive of a private business enterprise to do in-depth reporting around an issue such as HIV/AIDS if it's not profitable and going to actually meet their profit margins? The gap, though, could be, and there's always debate and discussion around this, is, does the journalism industry sort of go the way of the farming industry where there's a lot of tax credits and subsidies? Some people may scream that that's wrong, but the question is, if it's serving a public good, then why not figure out a way to lift the financial burden some so that there are more education reporters or reporters covering the state Supreme Court? But again, the question still lies in the hands of constituents around what that could and should look like. Otherwise, you will continue to see the shrinkages.
But take, for example, Kaiser Health News, which was basically an endowment or foundation. They are so, I think, well established now that they are collaborating with major mainstream news organizations, NPR, CNN, and others, and are being cited as such. So while they themselves may not be that large, their impact, they're punching well above their weight. So, and this is not an amateur organization. This is a very well-established vertical expertise.
A couple times now we've mentioned a report by the FCC. It came out last year. It was written, it's kind of, in the 80s there was A Nation at Risk that came out about the schools. And this is kind of the media at risk, is essentially what this report was. We've tried to get the gentleman who wrote it to, we thought about trying to Skype him in, but we figured it would be very Big Brother-ish to have a head looming over here. But if it's something that you're seriously interested in, it's got an executive summary. It is that thick, but it does have a summary. Jessica. Sorry.
Hi, how you doing? I would like to briefly get back to what really I believe is the reason that the catalyst for tonight's event, specifically, rather than speaking in broad terms about the future of news delivery, the actions of the Times-Picayune, specifically here in New Orleans. A lot of people just aren't buying what they're selling, that the sometimes Picayune is the only way for them to be a profitable print publication. And I think part of this goes to what you said at the panel earlier about the low lack of trust for the press right now. Perhaps some of that is due to the fact that the publisher of publications like that refer to the opinions of their readership as noise. Maybe that's part of the problem with the lack of mutual respect there. A lot of people are also having trouble understanding how Opelousas and Shreveport can afford a daily paper, but New Orleans can't, especially when groups like Forbes, Wall Street 24/7, and other online entities keep on saying that we're the fastest growing population big city in the United States recently. And lastly, I do believe in new technology and new media. I write a column for an online news website. I started a Facebook page about 6 weeks ago when the Sun-Times-Picayune announced that they were going to become the Sun-Times-Picayune, just a vent. And that was 6 weeks ago. And right now, when I vent, I now have a potential audience of 94,515, according to what they tell me on my Facebook page today. So I do believe in the strength and power and influence and importance of new technology. But the fact that at least 2 or 3 major entities are willing to come into this market and provide a daily paper, or at least try to, leads me to believe that somebody needs to paraphrase Mark Twain when they say the death of the daily paper in New Orleans, those reports are premature. I think that I believe that tens of thousands of New Orleanians believe that there's a way to make money in New Orleans with a daily newspaper, and I don't believe that the Times-Picayune is listening, and I think others should be allowed to have that opportunity, and that's why I support the boycotting of those, both the website and the Times-Picayune, because I think that economic pressure might work where so far letters from VIPs, petitions, appeals, letters to the editor, they've already made up their minds. They're closed-minded
and sir,
about
that's
it,
why we're here tonight, is to understand what the needs of the community are.
I'm sorry if I ran on. I'm sorry if I ran
Yeah.
on.
Appreciate your comments.
What's your name so we can Facebook you?
Was it? Yes, sir.
Okay. How you doing? My name is Vincent. I own a small business, Vintage Shades, vintage eyewear. Mine is basically geared towards the entrepreneur. How do you think the dissemination of traditional media brands will affect the ability to efficiently market to the consumer?
Well, you know, here I am representing nonprofits, but I've had a for-profit background. I mean, I think that what you're really asking, which is a really important point, which is how do you leverage media to reach an audience that you're trying to target, right? And, you know, I think that, you know, to use the G word here, I mean, Google has become a very efficient way to do that, but it is becoming such a competitive marketplace that keywords aren't always the most cost-effective way to do that, right? So I think that organizations, whether for-profit or non-profit, have, frankly, a duty and responsibility to measure their audience, to understand their impact, so they can help organizations or companies such as yours find that audience, because that should be an earned revenue stream for them. And I think that, you know, we talk so much about the end user and we talk so much about the models, but at the end of the day, the advertising model and, you know, what in the public space we call corporate sponsorships or underwriting has a tremendous value still. And I think that as you have more and more, folks playing in the media ecosystem, and if they're able to articulate to you, they should be able to capture your advertising dollars if they give you a good value prop. So I think the answer really boils down to what it's always boiled down to, is who's efficiently reaching their audience and how they're going to convey that to you.
And I think that gets to the issue of the accountability that the gentleman asked in the back, too. We're held accountable.
Weak for as news is concerned, if I associate my brand with you, then they might associate.
Oh yeah,
sure, right, and that's a hypothetical about my site, right?
But what you're also, I think, articulating is that in most local newspapers or news outlets, there's an earned media component. It's like the story of the mom and pop shop that really makes it popular to the community, builds their revenue and builds their brand. Does that disappear? And I think inevitably those types of stories and that type of presence does disappear when you don't have the same type of circulation. And so, again, the question does remain, how do you have localized content that not only benefits people in terms of the transparency and accountability space, but the business community, or knowing what resources are in the community that are benefiting, you know, my family and my children. And so there is that gap and that void that's actually tremendously huge. And again, the question mark remains is, how do you fill that gap, and who's responsible for filling that gap?
Now, there's one other issue which is probably not what you're asking, but I want to use it to leverage into, which is the IRS are using precedents from the 60s and 70s, even before cable television, to decide what should be qualified as a non-profit versus a for-profit. And they've said on multiple occasions effectively that if you are basically producing general news, even if it is to the benefit of the community, that's a for-profit enterprise. And so when you have for-profits pulling back in a marketplace and non-profits are unable to get their non-profit determination, which in technical terms is the 501c3, it's actually doing a disservice to the community. It's a huge disservice. And so, you know, I'm working with folks like the Knight Foundation and the Council on Foundations to help the IRS, you know, clarify what their policy should be, because, you know, I hear about the, you know, obviously the lens, and Steve and I can talk a lot about the IRS issues here, but there's new non-profits forming. I think people go into the space thinking, well, a non-profit is basically the exact same thing as a for-profit, only I don't have shareholders. Well, right now, that's not the way the law is written. So as you as an enterprise want to reach a certain audience, it may be that a non-profit has that audience, but they may not be able to accept advertising from you because the IRS says no. So that's another threat to the whole non-profit space, which I talk a lot about under separate issues.
And as a side note...
Yes, they are.
They have a special.
The IRS is, yeah, the IRS has a special bug up its, you know what, for nonprofit use right now.
And if you want to see examples of the types of nonprofits that are doing this type of work that's being held up from a policy perspective by the IRS, I know that the New Haven Independent in New Haven and the Voice of San Diego are two entities right now that are facing this kind of immediate struggle among many. And so there are models out there, but the question is the public going to step up from a policy perspective and demand that there be a shift? Because if there is a policy shift, then you open up the door for, again, another opportunity to fill the gap or to fill the void.
So, Steve, I'm going to ask you as the moderator for a second. Can you share a little bit about your experience with the IRS?
Sure. The lens applied for 501c3 status 22 months ago. I think the average wait is closer to 6 weeks or 3 months. The IRS was very concerned that we were being set up to help a for-profit organization that we've partnered with. They were concerned, in large part, about whether the level of benefit with the for-profit that we're associated with, WVUE television, did the for-profit benefit more than we profited from that venture. We're part of a cohort of about 5 nonprofits across the country, news sites that are waiting to get this. I think 30, 35 others had already gotten through before the IRS said, whoa, what's with all these nonprofits? And so they threw down the gate, and we ran into it. And we continue to wait.
By the way, that's not to say that the IRS is not doing its job. It is. It's just that it's doing its job in a way that's time-consuming, which is happening at a critical point in the media landscape. So unfortunately, it's really, really bad timing for communities as well as for folks in the media space.
Jessica?
It's interesting that the gentleman over there is having trouble selling his articles on HIV. I was listening to Roland Martin the other morning, Sunday morning, and he said that AIDS is a very serious problem in the black community, and it's not being covered by the media the way it did initially when it was considered a white male's disease, and now that it's a black community disease, it's not being covered, and he bears it out by saying he can't sell his articles. So I just thought that was very interesting.
Thank you. I want to know if he has vintage eye shades that will match the seersucker suit. I think that's we might be able to work on that. Yeah. Yeah.
Talk to me after the meeting.
All right.
Stay right up. I was sort of wondering, Jamal, especially, it sounds like we're supposed to give up on the idea that people would have one news source that they trusted. It doesn't seem like there's an education campaign to let everybody from the various communities know that they have to check more than one news source. I was wondering, are we still fighting that fight to be the source that people listen to, or are we ourselves going to encourage people to don't just trust me, but go make sure you read 4 different articles on the same subject?
I think in some ways that question plays out in a very subjective way, meaning, you know, the position that I take on behalf of the organization I work with is not, you should not seek for diversified news sources that are credible. The issue is, in a community space, how is the community involved in the creation of media and the ownership of media? And so it's really the notion of community scale. And when you think about what's playing out here in New Orleans, at least with the newspaper in question, it's a privately held newspaper, and it's one newspaper. And the question is that even sufficient for a community of this size, and a diverse community of this size that's continuing to grow and having to wrestle with issues that the rest of the world is watching? And so in many ways, if all of your eggs, so to speak, are in one basket, and the basket is shrinking, how do we expand the actual access to news and media, but also the community involvement? And it goes back to, it's different audiences, it's different individuals. And so in many ways, the question goes beyond just the notion of having one source, but what is the policy implications? What are the business drivers, which I think several of you have brought up? And then going even deeper, what are the community connections and responsibilities and obligations? And so if we don't address all of that, having that one source, I think, is not necessarily sufficient.
Just like she was saying about that we were 3 years in the past and now we're 3 years in the future, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of catch-up. There's a huge generation of my parents' generation, obviously, that just watch Fox News and only think that one news source. So, I mean, you said something earlier that I took notes about, that it's imperative that we don't just listen to one news source. I mean, it seems like the vast majority of people don't know that.
So to overgeneralize data, which is apparently what I seem to be doing this evening, the data seems to say that active news consumers, which is obviously not everybody and not everybody we want to be, but that people who are engaged in getting news get news from multiple sources is generally the theme of that. So it's not as much you have people who are ardent readers of the Times-Picayune or ardent watchers of Fox News or whatever who aren't looking somewhere else. I think the two questions are, one, for people who aren't actively looking for stuff, what do you do for those folks? And second, if you have people who are looking at multiple sources, and we're in an environment that's increasingly fragmented, where there are parts of New Orleans that aren't being covered, that you as a community want to be covered, how do you make sure that those outlets that are popping up and those people who are popping up to cover those things get into the news habits of the people? You know what I mean? So yeah.
So, right. Sure. Now, in other markets, in other cities, you're seeing a lot more cooperation between for-profits and non-profits, right? So, look, commercial realities have dictated that certain desks have been pulled back from. And if I look at San Francisco, for example, the Center for Investigative Reporting and California Watch there published stories that went on, into multiple for-profit news organizations and worked on a collaborative basis, or they pick up their stories on like a syndication basis. Unfortunately, it's my understanding that there's a competitive environment in this community which is kind of very old school, which is saying that they're not going to let those multiple voices come in. So to the point I'm making here is that it could be that you're picking up a paper and it actually has information from ProPublica or The Lens or these other places. It's still a trusted place, but the burden of producing that civic-minded content doesn't necessarily have to come from one source. Again, unfortunately, in this particular market, it doesn't seem that the management understands that.
All right, let me get down to, we're getting down to the last 10 minutes. I'm going to move to a lightning round of questions. So a quick question, we get one panelist to respond, and we'll try to get as many in as we can.
Oh my God, lightning. I don't know if I can do anything with lightning. But thank you to all y'all for letting me know that NPR are now actually broadcasting however many hours a day, because I cut them out because all I could get was classical music. And then when I would listen to them, they were saying, well, this segment is brought to you by Homeland Security. And or Monsanto. And I'm a community activist. I'm also a human rights activist. I believe that information is a human right. I go to all these seminars all the time. If you want a snapshot of my life, I get up in the morning, I turn on Democracy Now! How what?
We're calling for the lightning round.
Okay, well, my question is, okay, well, the whole thing is there's a huge disconnect between what goes on in the news and what goes on in the actual community. We need to bridge that gap somehow. Even the reporters, beautiful reporters from the Times-Picayune, who I respect highly, were not able to report effectively because they were being editorialized. So how do we bridge that gap between community and the powers that be? And I have to say that part of what I do as a community activist is involve the community, and I want to involve this woman right here because she's been waiting all night to ask her question. So.
First of all, I want to thank all of you for coming. I'm Lynetta Gilbert, and I'm honored to be one of the board members of the Foundation for Louisiana that's sponsoring this. One of the reasons that we're sponsoring this panel, it's the brilliant idea of our CEO, is that we believe that media is a part of the civic culture of all communities. And if, in fact, that's the case, then I guess I'm really wondering what happens to the issues of community building and engagement of community when we lose a major form of media. In New Orleans, though, I'm wondering, is this an opportunity for us to really take a serious look at ways in which we can start to pull together all the forms of community media that we have in order to be much more inclusive about information? I'm also wondering if there is a way for us to really get stories from families and community members who may not be here in this audience tonight, but who are often below the fold in our newspapers, and their stories take up a majority of the time on the internet and also in other forms of media. So I'm still looking for ways in which we can maximize on the decision of the Times-Picayune to try to bring together the network of groups that we have to create a stronger civic culture. And the last thing I want to say is I'm wondering also if this is not a situation akin to taking manufacturing out of America and abroad and then finding ourselves trying to bring it back and reconnect in communities. All of you know that the Boston Globe had a terrific international reporting community, and several other print media had lots of international reporters. They no longer have that. And so now we're still wondering, we're getting news uncurated sometimes from across the globe. I'm wondering, is this our opportunity to strengthen in America what we know about what's happening in the redevelopment of American communities and to put it through the local media?
All right, who wants to tackle that one real quick?
I won't try to tackle the enormity of that very important question, but one thing I will say, I mean, regardless of what's happening with the Times-Picayune, one of the things that we try to do at Knight Foundation, and we're in a tiny slice of a huge thing, but in terms of this space, is to encourage people to think about the fact that it is cheaper than it has ever been, essentially, to try new things. Partly that's technology, like if I want to build a website or I want to build a tool or an iPhone app or whatever, the sort of Silicon Valley model of building things, right? It's cheaper to do that than ever before. But in general, right, you can build some kind of proof of concept of most things you might want to do in a weekend, right? Whether that's a particular story that you want to try and get on covering, or that's a website you want to build like Homicide Watch, or that's some technology thing that you think is missing. But we see a lot of people out there who care about sort of civic engagement and care about communities who will, and like Code for America is a great example of this at the national level, are attracting people who will get together over the weekend over pizza and like build a thing that is an incredibly rudimentary implementation of an application for tracking the status of property lots, like urban blight or whatever. And you can build that in a weekend, right? And then show it to people and say, hey, do you think this is valuable? What's that? Sure, but I'm speaking more generally. I mean, it's just one example is that technology costs are really cheap. But so one thing we try to do is encourage people to build that initial implementation, to think about what is the thing you could build for your idea about improving your community or improving the information ecosystem that's really cheap that you could build for a small amount of money or in a few months or whatever, and get it off the ground and then see what happens. And there's a huge potential to do that that's been opened up, and that's really exciting, and there are obviously downsides to that, but there's a new realm of possibility there. And so like, in our little corner of the world, we're doing a prototype initiative to offer like $50,000 grants or less over a couple-month time cycle to people who want to build and test new ideas. And it's one tiny corner of the larger need, but that's one thing we think about a lot is it's easy to try new ideas, or easier, and that's a huge potential.
Let me just quickly add also that cooperatives like NOCOG, which is why we're here, are a good start towards that, right? So leveraging what's in the community, working together to create efficiencies and publish content and be cooperative and collaborate is a great place to start. I mean, to Chris's point, the cost of buying a printing press and distribution system to print a newspaper is extremely high. Yes, nobody has a computer, but the cost of producing a website or a blog today is a lot lower. But more importantly, leveraging audiences and working together so that there's less overlap is actually quite a good model, I think, moving forward.
And from a policy perspective, if you really think about, again, I hate to bring it back to policy, but the erosion of what has happened in terms of the FCC, when I think about their report on programming in 1960, where they talked about, requirements for local ownership and elevating local talent, investing in communities of color, and all of these components being connected to license renewal, that was eroded under the Reagan administration. And so in 2007, communities started raising their voices in town hall meetings and saying, we have to find the tipping point or the balance. And in many ways, New Orleans and communities like it could be, again, the tipping point to get us back to a place where the public interest and the public good is actually a part of the regulation of the enterprise and of the business entities that are dominant in this space. Otherwise, guess what? You're dealing with market conditions similar to like manufacturing jobs going overseas. And unless we shift the paradigm, it's not going to change fundamentally.
All right. Elise.
I just feel like a lot of the conversation is based on the premise that the Times-Picayune was failing as a public servant, as a business, and it wasn't. It was profitable. It had one of the highest penetration rates in the country and had some of the most brilliant reporters in the world on the staff that are now gone to Atlanta and LA and scattered. And the premise seems to be that this was inevitable, and I don't think it's been addressed that this was not inevitable, that it was a successful business and public service, and this didn't need to happen this way to this company. This city read the newspaper, the city supported the newspaper, and yes, I understand the business. I am not unrealistic about moving digital, but number one, at the same time we're moving digital, you give us the crappiest website ever while we're moving digital, which doesn't go together, it doesn't fit. I mean, if you're gonna do that, you give us the most amazing website ever, not what they gave us. And so I just don't get fundamentally why, addressing why a news source that is respected, you cannot buy trust. It was not perfect, and I don't disagree with competition. I think the Lens and I think the Uptown Messenger and NOLA Defender and a variety of other sources were creating competition and diversity. But it worked. TV did not want the Times-Picayune to go under. TV wakes up in the morning and reads the Times-Picayune. We weren't competitors. We were a team, all the news sources. So I don't feel like this conversation has addressed why this happened here now.
Well, I think to start off, you're absolutely right that in 2010 and 2011, the Times-Picayune was profitable and actually paid out bonuses. That's the reality. But I think the other reality that I want to insert, and I've said this in, I think, several formats.
I just need to jump in one. It wasn't a bonus. The employees were furloughed, and those furlough monies were made up at the end of the year. So it was making them whole again.
It was making them whole, but based on profit margins. So it's a tweak, but I think at the end of the day, it's a privately held company. And that's something that it's hard to swallow, but when you start to think about the public interest, that's where the policies come in to think about how do you balance the public interest with private enterprise. And I'm not justifying or saying anything about the company itself, but that's the reality, is that you're dealing with the corporate interests, and those decisions are made in many ways behind closed doors that don't involve us in this room in the same way. But as consumers, as community members, that's where you have the power to elevate your voice and determine, what could happen in order to shift the paradigm. And I think that's where, for many ways, this community is really going to have to struggle over the next months and years to determine what are the right and appropriate next steps.
I deeply regret that we're out of time. I hope that we're able to have.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
She's gonna get the last question in. I'm gonna let her.
And I apologize.
All right.
I haven't heard the answer to it, and that's why I'm going to ask it. My name is Dorothy Smith. I write for Examiner.com. The beat that I cover here in New Orleans is the beat for jobs and employment. And the question that I have is, what do I tell my readers, particularly those people that want to move to New Orleans or are moving to New Orleans, about their potential opportunities for being employed in journalism, in communications, in Southeast Louisiana? Just want to know the answer, because I do write stories like that, basically giving them advice on what to do or where to go.
Well, my nonprofit, we've recently hired someone. It's only one. The new effort at the University of New Orleans that will be called New Orleans Reporter, they hope to get up and running before the end of the year. I imagine there'll be some reporting opportunities there. The Times-Picayune is continuing, and NOLA Media Group is continuing to hire people there. It's difficult to track that.
But to put it another way, I think something that Chris said, which is, and Kelly said also, the number of journalism jobs has gone down, but the ability to start an entrepreneurial venture yourself that speaks authentically to a community, I think has never been stronger. So if we're living in an environment where people are being underrepresented, my feeling would be get into those communities, be authentic to their communities, give them a product that they want and use, and then folks like the gentleman who wants to sell vintage eyeglasses will leverage that and actually put advertising there. I mean, this is the free market, right? So if there's opportunity and there's audience and there's need, you should be able to capitalize on it.
There's also a new breed of journalists that's rising, and it's the old-fashioned freelancer, but freelancers now make up a much larger proportion of the people who I think make their living as journalists. It's a hard way to make a living because you essentially have instead of having one boss, you have 20 bosses, and that's if you're lucky. Freelancers are rising up everywhere, and that's, when I tell kids that are coming out of college and they're knocking on the door trying to get into professional news organizations and they just can't, I tell them to develop expertise in something and start blogging about it or making that expertise known so that they then can start selling their work. And I do see more and more people making a living as freelancers. Now, I don't know how they pay their health insurance, but...
Well,
Right. Well, there you go. There you go.
So we're having this event 2 months before changes at the Times-Picayune take place. I don't discount having a similar event 2 months after. I think it would be interesting to get together and understand. Right now there's a lot of anxiety about what ifs and what changes are going to come in. Will the Advocate come in with a successful edition? Will the new effort at UNO succeed and be healthy? Will the Lens continue to be here in 3 months? Yes, we will. But please, I think this is the kind of community engagement Dr. Dewey mentioned right at the beginning that's essential for us to understand what makes a better news outlet that serves the community. Again, I want to thank the sponsors, the New Orleans Coalition on Open Governance, the Foundation for Louisiana, Greater New Orleans, Inc., and our kind hosts here at Loyola University School of Mass Communications. There's a box for surveys being waved in our general direction up at the corner if you'd like to deposit those. Thank you all so much.